Welcome back to the Defenders and Disciples show. Today my guest is Dr. T.C. Fuller. Dr. Fuller is a former Army officer and retired special agent for the FBI with over 32 years of experience in federal law enforcement. He also worked as an interrogator at Guantanamo Bay during the global war on terrorism. TC has authored several books, including No Safe Alternative, Painting Over Rust, and his most recent work, Empathy for the Devil, which we discussed during the show. He also offers high-end security consulting and premier firearms training through his company, the Horus Group. And now I give you Dr. T.C. Fuller. Morning, Dr. Fuller. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm well, sir. How are you?
I'm doing outstanding. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you so very much for having me.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. Before we get started, I'm going to go through these icebreaker questions, and we'll go from there.
Seems fair.
Who's one person you'd want to have on your team during a zombie apocalypse or similar scenario?
The zombie apocalypse. The invasion of the Canadian 13th Mongolian One-Hump Camel Brigade.
Yes.
You know, you sent me that list of questions to pick from, and it occurred to me that the guy at the top of that list, this right now as I sit here, is probably Rich Brown.
Okay.
Over at American Warrior Society. And that's not just because I get along real well with Rich. And if you got to be stuck with somebody in a zombie apocalypse, it better be somebody that you get along with.
Yeah.
But the man has an incredibly diverse and deep skill set. He's very well read, so his mastery of a wide variety of things is shocking. And plus, he's close enough to me that if I had to walk there, I could do it. 10 days. And so right now, I think he's certainly the top of my list.
Well, I think that's who Mike Seeklander picked. So whoever gets there first. That's cool. What about if you could master one skill overnight? What would that be?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I really like that question. And I had to think on it. But right now, today, given the way of the world, it occurs to me that Mandarin would probably top that list. Now, I can get by in a few languages, French, German, Spanish, English, Arabic, but nothing in Mandarin or Cantonese. So I think Mandarin would probably be it for me. Just because of the arc I see the world kind of heading in the next 20 years. It'd be a handy skill to have.
It's interesting. Yeah. It's seeming like that. Seems like that is becoming more and more relevant, and as sad as that sounds, but
yeah. 10 years ago, my eldest daughter in college was taking Mandarin classes, and I thought, man, that's an odd thing to take. Of all the languages that I thought would be much more useful in the moment, Spanish certainly topped the list. French, if you're going to travel as she does. But she went with Mandarin, and I have to say, 10 years on, I'm like, smart move, kid. Well done. Well played.
Is she fluent?
I don't know that she's fluent. Obviously, I don't have any means to gauge that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how well she's kept up with it. But she has a master's degree in linguistic anthropology, I believe is what it is. So she's got a thing about languages.
Wow.
But I honestly can't tell you if she's fluent or not. I mean, she could count to 10 in Mandarin in front of me, and I'd think she was having reading Confucius.
Yeah. That's awesome. What about the most unusual or interesting job you've ever had?
Yeah, that's a good one. For me, I've had a couple. I've been really fortunate. For somebody that started working, I think I got my first W-2 when I was 15, and I worked straight through until I retired at age 50. I've had a lot of really interesting jobs. Some of them really, really bad, like pretty much any adult, right? You've all just had the lousy job experience. And some of them really great. But for interesting, I would have to say the most interesting's probably happened while I was in the FBI.
Okay.
And although being a bomb disposal commander in the Sinai Desert was pretty interesting, it had its moment. But in the FBI, I was in the Office of Congressional Affairs up on Capitol Hill. So I was a fly on a wall in a lot of high-powered meetings between high-powered people that you've heard of.
Wow.
I certainly had nothing creative to add to those conversations. I was the guy who fetched the spoon for the guy who was fetching the coffee, kind of thing. But that was very interesting, just to be in the room when some of those conversations were being had. Some of the things that are discussed in skiffs in the Senate and the House.
Mm-hmm.
When they're talking about some of the intelligence missions that the FBI had pulled off, and I'm sitting there listening to it, and it's obviously stuff that I've tried very hard to forget and will never discuss anywhere ever. But you kind of sit there and you have these moments where you're like, we did that? And that's really cool. How do we pull that off? So that was kind of interesting. And then I was an interrogator in Guantanamo Bay, and to a certain extent in Afghanistan as well. And that was interesting. That really put me at the pointy end of the spear in the early days of the global war on terror. And depending on how you define interesting, it was certainly interesting in my rubric. So I found it very fascinating stuff.
Speaking of those like congressional hearings and stuff, or congressional committees, and without obviously violating OPSEC or any sort of documents, NDAs you signed, when you're sitting in those meetings, and I know that like some of this stuff is like, oh my gosh, we did that. Like it's like the actual information is amazing. But in terms of like how the meetings are held, is it basically? I would imagine that it's basically just like any other corporate meeting where there's not this. People seem to apply this mystery to the way government does things behind closed doors, and it's just like any other corporation. It's just like any other business meeting. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, sure. The truth of the matter is, as crazy as you think the people on Capitol Hill are, they're much worse in person. They're far, far worse in person. I mean, you pick your favorite or least favorite member of Congress, and I can promise you that what you see on TV is a sliver of who that person is. Dianne Feinstein, for example, was famous that she wouldn't let anybody that worked on her staff wear red because red had a gravitas that only she could truly carry.
Wow.
Women had to come to work with skirts of a certain length, and their hair had to be coiffed. Her word, not mine. Had to be done, and if it wasn't, you're going home, and you're not long for that job. And other members of Congress are just the same. I just pick her because it was the first one. But when you have these meetings, let's say that we have Senator Wright from North Dakota. Well, Senator Wright doesn't just show up by himself, right? He brings his army of toadies with him. And so when you'll have a big congressional meeting, some of them are open and some of them are closed. Obviously, a lot of the intel meetings are closed. And everybody in the room has to have a security clearance. But the members of Congress, the actual members of Congress, once they're put on those committees, they are blessed with the appropriate clearances.
Right.
Many of them can't pass a background check. I mean, there are members of Congress that are convicted criminals that have known associates that are in the Weather Underground or the Black Panthers or even worse organizations. And so they couldn't pass a security clearance. But because they're in Congress and they're on the Senate Intelligence Committee, poof, they get a security clearance. Yeah. And then we all scratch our heads and clutch our pearls when things leak. So when you show up at these meetings, depending on the size of the meeting and the level of security for the meeting, there may be 10 members of Congress there and 40 people in the room. The really interesting, and then it proceeds exactly like you said. It's a board meeting, and a lot of it's pontificating. Each member will get 5 minutes to talk, and especially when they're questioning somebody. And it's more of a, how great am I? Enough about me. What do you think about me? They're looking for a soundbite that they can use in their re-election campaign. Or, the FBI is a member of the executive branch. Obviously, Congress is legislative branch. Well, depending on who is sitting in the chair in the White House, it may be a Democrat, it may be a Republican, you can expect the FBI to get beat up by the opposing party. So when Obama is president, the Republicans are going to beat up the FBI. Not because they necessarily disagree with the FBI, don't like the FBI, but because it's a way of punching the guy in the chair down the street. So you get a lot of that. That can really interfere with any kind of meaningful, meeting outcomes. And then as the level of security rises, the level of sensitivity rises, the fewer and fewer people are in the room. And so once it's set by standard, maybe even law, I don't know, but by policy. Every so long a time, the Bureau and the other various intelligence agencies will go up there by themselves, and they will sit with the chair of the Intelligence Committee, the Senate Intelligence Committee, and then they'll also do it for the House. And they'll sit with the ranking member. Now, the ranking member is simply defined as the highest ranking person on the committee from the party that is not in power. Okay, so let's say the Democrats are running the Senate. The chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee will be a Democrat, the ranking member on that committee will be a Republican. So you
Okay.
get the top 2 people in the room, and that's it. No staff, nobody else, and you're in a very small skiff. And that's when you really show them the crown jewels. You'll show them the top 3 to 5 intelligence operations that are ongoing, and that's so that you comply with the laws surrounding congressional oversight. So once you've told a member of Congress in that environment, you've, in essence, notified Congress. You fulfilled your mandate to maintain congressional oversight on your activities.
Mm-hmm.
And those meetings were really interesting because it's very, very minimal number of people in the room, very, very small skiff. My first apartment was bigger than some of these skiffs, and just tiny, tiny little closets. And you have to tell them what's going on. And with any luck, they don't tell anybody else.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Since they don't have a security clearance, what is stopping them from sharing that? If you have someone that just decides that I feel like the public needs to know about this.
And I think that's part of the congressional mandate. It's an excellent question. They will tell you that, well, you'll hear this a lot. The American public needs to know. I'm like, buddy, you haven't met a member of the American public in 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
When was the last time you rolled into a 7-Eleven at 8 o'clock at night and gassed up and got yourself a hot dog and a Monster? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it happens. So don't tell me about the American public. However, the phrase is still used. And they do. I don't want to say they don't have a security clearance. They have one. It's just granted by fiat, by virtue of the fact.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they didn't have to go through the typical process that we had to go through.
Precisely. They could never pass the background checks that we've been through.
Mm-hmm.
But they have one. Now, there are laws about holding on to classified information. You're not supposed to tell anybody. But as we all know, there are rules and there are rules, right?
Or keep it in your bathroom, on a server in your bathroom.
Yeah, you should not do that. Unless you're just too old and enfeebled for us to process. Like, what a great defense. I've never heard of that anywhere else. Don't think I'm not going to use it when I'm 90.
Yeah.
But what will get you and I in trouble won't necessarily get a congressman in trouble. And it's unfair, and it flies right in the face of we are a nation of laws.
Mm-hmm.
But it is also reality.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I've had occasions where we briefed classified information on the Hill, and a half an hour later, I was in my office, and I had a little TV on my desk, like we all did, and I'm watching one of the congressmen who was in that meeting brief CNN live from Capitol Hill on the essence of what we just told him. I'm like, that was a classified briefing. How's he getting? I'm looking at my boss going, what? And he's like, really? You think we're going to be able to arrest that guy? I'm like, we could try. Nope. Shut up, sit down, go back to work.
Yeah.
So I saw that happen. What can I tell you? I don't like it. It offends me philosophically. It offends me professionally. But I'm also, I was 10 years ago. I'm not losing any sleep over it now because it happened before I got there. It's continuing to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I could stress myself into an early grave over it. Or I could not.
Let's talk about that in your career. Like, so you were in the Army as an officer, correct? And then what led you to go into the FBI? Or if you want to talk about your EOD career as well, and then what led you into the FBI career? If you ever find yourself in a situation where you have to use deadly force to defend yourself or to defend someone else, then you're going to want a good legal team defending you after the fact. And that's why I trust attorneys on retainer. And if you want to see how AOR compares to those other CCW insurance providers, then scan this QR code or check out my affiliate link in the description. They have individual and family plans so that you will be legally protected should you ever need to protect your life or someone else's life. And don't forget to use promo code DAD to save $25 on your initial sign up.
I came in the Army at a time where the Clinton drawdown was getting ready to happen and did happen. My year groups the year groups around mine got chopped pretty heavily as the military was drawing down. The Army came up with a plan whereby they would let you do combat arms. If you volunteered for it, you could do combat arms, which is infantry, armor, aviation. Mm-hmm. I don't know, 2 others, engineers, and something else. And then they would draft you over into a support branch. And I fell into that battle. So I was a grunt for several years, but they told me, hey, look, the day's coming when you're going to have to be an ordnance guy. And I didn't want to be an ordnance guy because 90% of the ordnance guys were what we call a wrench, right? They were mechanics. Mm-hmm. And I was one of those infantry guys that whenever my Bradley broke, I'd go down and yell at the mechanics, hey, fix my Bradley. The defense of Western Europe is dependent on my Bradley. You better get it fixed. Well, I didn't want to be on the other end of that pointy finger, right? Mm-hmm. And I had no interest in doing that. And honestly, if I was going to do maintenance, I'm glad there are people that do it. But if I was going to do that, I'll just go work for Walmart and make twice the money and far fewer mortar shells.
Right.
So that time came when they said, okay, it's time to go. And so I put in a packet to apply for Special Forces Assessment and Selection. It would be a Green Beret. And I put in for Explosive Ordnance Disposal packet at the same time. And EOD turnaround was much faster. They said, yep, come on to school. And I said, cool, I'm gone. And I jumped into the EOD world and took off down that way. And that was great. There was some really great people to work with. I'm still in touch with some of my soldiers from back in the day. Just a really great, intelligent crew that I really had a lot of fun working with. We had a real world mission. It had honest to God danger. So you didn't get to monkey around with the silly crap. You really had to concentrate on what you were doing. And I really enjoyed that and thrived in that. And I was humming right along. I got a couple of commands, which was a rarity back then. And all the signs were on the wall for further advancement. But I was also 5 years into being a dad, and I had been gone for 3 of them. And my little girl was getting used to Dad being gone and was asking me, so when are you leaving again, Dad? And that was starting to hurt.
Yeah.
And my wife at the time said, hey, this isn't going to work forever. So if this is the way you want to go forth, but don't expect me to be around that. Now, she didn't say it quite that calmly and reasonably, but you get the point.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine had gone into the FBI, and I'd known him since we'd been cadets in ROTC back in the day. He was really enjoying it. He was also from the San Francisco Bay Area, as I was. And he was applying, and then he got picked up and went. And I was commanding at Fort Bragg at the time. And he invited me to come up to his graduation, which was just up at Quantico, a few hours up the road. So I went, and I had already started an application process at that point, but I wasn't really sold on the idea. And once I went and talked to him, saw all the people that were there, I was like, man, this is like a cult. All these people are crazy happy about this. This is nuts. And I said, well, I'll keep applying, but I understand that they are going to hire adults. They're not going to hire me. They'll hire somebody that's a functioning adult member of society. But, I also saw a pay chart at the time, and the pay was much better in the Bureau than it was I could expect. I was in the Army, I was post-Gulf War, but pre-9/11. So there was nothing really on the horizon. And a peacetime Army is an entirely different animal. And I'd had a taste early in my career with the wartime Army, and that was much better than the peacetime Army. So it was looking like it was going to be a pretty boring remainder of the career. And the FBI offered better pay, home, watch my daughter grow up, and be in the States. I'd done a lot of time in the Middle East already. And so I applied, and I honestly didn't expect to get hired, but I did. So I was like, well, now what? So then I really had to sit down and have some soul-searching conversations with my wife and figure out, okay, am I going to fish or cut bait? What's going to happen here? And I decided on the FBI. So I left the Army while I was still having a good time. I'm a big believer in leaving the party while you're having fun. And jumped in the FBI, said, hey, I'd love to go to San Francisco, San Diego, Sacramento, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle. You see the pattern. And the day came, they said, hey, how do you feel about Vermont? I was like, yes, sir. Roger out. Vermont it is. So up I went, and I'd spent a decade up there, about 30 miles from the Canadian border.
Wow. What was your first assignment or field office? What did you do?
The first field office was the Albany Division, and I went to the Burlington Resident Agency, so the Burlington RA. And interesting thing about the Bureau is there's a lot of misinformation out there. A lot of people base their opinions on Hollywood. We all did. I did when I got in. The only FBI agents I'd ever seen before I applied had been, Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., right? It's just I'd never seen an FBI agent. I know. And so I got up there, and in the small office, there's only 6 agents in that office, plus a supervisor. The maxim was you catch them, you clean them. So whatever came through the door, if it happened to land on you, it was your case. And that might be a bank robbery. It might be a known intelligence agent from Cuba up here on vacation going skiing. It might be anything in between. If you answered the phone, because we would get calls, in the bigger offices, you have a switchboard and there's sort of steps to getting to an agent. Whatever gets to you, and information can be vetted, the crazies can be filtered out.
Right.
So you'll tend to work specific violations. So go to New York City, there's a There's a Gambino crime family squad. And that's all they do is work the Gambino. There's a Medicaid fraud. There's in Los Angeles, you'll have a Crips squad that just works the Crips. You'll have, so that kind of thing. You have much more specialization opportunities. So it's a narrower field, but it's much deeper in depth. You don't have that in the RAs because you just don't have the personnel to do it. So in the 10 years I was up there, when I first got there, the boss asked me, what do you want to work? Well, I'm a brand new guy, and only professional experience I really had been in the Army. So to me, the only answer is, yes, sir, 3 bags full. Whatever you want done, I'll do. But I did have enough sense to say, but I'd really prefer not to work crimes against children.
Yeah.
Because I find that very difficult, especially with a 5-year-old daughter.
Yeah.
And I spent the next 10 years working a lot of crimes against children.
Oh, my gosh.
I ended up being the crimes against children coordinator for the state of Vermont for most of that time. Now, I worked everything we had because, like I said, you catch them, you clean them. But if anybody else caught a child case, they would kick it over to me. And if I caught a really insanely detailed bank fraud case, for example, well, we had a accountant, the CPA on the squad that liked working those cases, so I would kick that over to him if he needed it. So, there was some cross-leveling. We had one guy that just really, really, really worked healthcare fraud real hard, so he tended to get all of those. Now, when I say all, probably 80, 90%. So other cases leaked out to other people. And that was true for all of us. I did that for a decade. And the good news about that is you get to put some really, really bad people into really dark places.
Yeah.
So that's satisfying. The downside is the victims.
Yeah.
I was never super enthusiastic about talking to the victims. I mean, sometimes you simply had to. But to the extent I could, I would have the victims dealt with by Child Protective Services and people who were professionals in that arena. Both because you get better evidence out of them and because it was just too heartbreaking for me to sit down with a 7-year-old who wanted to show me on the anatomically correct doll where Uncle Bob touched him. That was very difficult to do.
Yeah, those are always the worst calls for me involving children.
Yeah, anything involving kids, especially patrol officers deal with car accidents with kids. That would put me over the edge. That would put me absolutely over the edge.
So we have, I don't know how many 3-letter agencies, and then be it in the IC and the intelligence community, and then also in like the law enforcement side, FBI, ATF, all those. Can you explain, what are your thoughts on, is it better to have more or is it better to have less? And then explain to the viewer listening, how is a case determined whether or not it's going to go to the FBI or the ATF? Because a lot of times there's a lot of overlap, right? There's firearms involved or there's drugs involved. So it's like, okay, does this go to the DEA? Does this go to the ATF? Can you talk about that a little bit and kind of maybe shed some light on the nuance and like how they distinguish that? And again, going back to is it better to have more or less?
Yeah, the more or less question is, that's a good one. By having more agencies, you certainly heighten the potential for confusion. You heighten the potential for territorialism. You heighten those interagency quarrels, the ability for those things to happen. So that, and nobody really benefits from those kind of things except the bad guys. That's who benefits from that. If you're with the local PD and I'm with the FBI and we don't get along, well, maybe you end up taking something at a local level that would be better addressed at the federal level. And maybe I simply ignore something at the federal level because it's a local matter.
Or if you're with the Secret Service, I'm in local law enforcement, and we decide not to have comms on the day that the former president is speaking,
It's a low threat environment. Why would we worry too much?
Yeah.
But you see my point, right? So you have multiple agencies responsible in that realm. The potential for drop balls gets higher. The problem with a single monolithic agency is it's a single monolithic agency, right? It becomes very ponderous. It becomes very difficult to respond to breaking new ways of criminal behavior. It can be, if suddenly tomorrow the FBI was, rather than just the de facto National Police Force, was actually the National Police Force, you'd have one guy at the top of that. Personally, I think the FBI has a lot of power concentrated in a very small group of hands now. If you were to take that 30,000 man agency and turn it into a 250,000 man agency, the potential for misuse, potential for abuse, I think goes right through the ceiling.
Yep.
It also becomes very difficult to manage, right? I mean, you were in a PD that had how many people? How many sworn in your PD?
Just a few hundred.
Okay, so let's just say for the sake of argument, 300. Of those 300, what's the percentage of bosses? From level sergeant on up. 25%.
Not many.
15%.
Yeah, maybe less than that.
Yeah. So your span of control becomes an issue, right? If I've got to supervise 4 or 5 people, okay, I can probably do that. If I have to supervise 20, well, that becomes more difficult. And like with anything, 90% of my effort is going to go into 10% of the kids, right? There's always that 10% that's going to be the personnel problem.
Right.
Well, now expand that out into the hundreds of thousands of bodies. So I think it becomes really, really difficult to sort of internally police. You become very, very hidebound. You kind of start to hide behind your blue wall. It becomes very difficult to communicate, good and bad. So more agencies, fewer agencies, I don't know. I think there's strong arguments for either one. But I'll say this: when I was in D.C., there were 26 different law enforcement agencies with arrest authority inside the District of Columbia. 26.
That's insane.
That's nuts. In an area the size of what? The county I live in now?
Yeah. My gosh, so 26.
It's absolutely insanity. So you could be in a foot pursuit with somebody, and not me, of course, because feds don't chase people. Feds don't run. It panics the locals. But let's suppose that you're a patrol officer and you're in a foot pursuit, and the guy runs through the national park, runs across the Smithsonian Mall, dodges through, the Treasury building, some of these public access buildings. Well, all of a sudden now you've got criminal behavior transitioning 4 or 5 different agencies.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's not a good solution. So your question about that is it cuts to the heart of a singular problem that we have in the law enforcement in this country. Of course, it's also a country of 335 million people. It takes a bit to police that. Although we have shockingly few cops per capita in this country for a population the size that we have. You wouldn't know it to see the nightly news, but it's an amazingly well-behaved society that we're in.
No, it is. Yeah.
Percentage-wise. As far as moving a case into FBI hands, DEA hands, ATF hands, that can get pretty territorial at the boss level. And, when we're talking about SAC level people, the person who's in charge of an FBI field office, for example. The chiefs in the field office domain, and, some of them get along with the FBI great. They're National Academy graduates. They love the FBI. Some of them, Boston PD comes to mind, hate the FBI. Absolutely despise the FBI. The first week or two I was in the Bureau took off a whole slew of cops in the New Orleans Police Department for corruption. It was a racketeering case, it was a RICO case, went all the way up to and including murder for hire. I mean, the PD was really out of control. Well, the guys who were left after that house cleaning by the feds probably not going to be real fondly inclined towards the FBI.
Yeah.
So if they get a guy with drugs and a gun and a phone number that comes back to Abu Hassan, maybe they're going to give it to the DEA, right? Because that patrol officer is going to give it to a detective. The detective's going to look at that and go, yeah, not my problem. But I'm not going to call those FBI guys because they just hooked up my partner last week in prison, so screw them. I'm going to call DEA or I'm going to call ATF. And, depending on the relationships at that point is whether or not ATF or DEA kicks it over. Now, as soon as they figure out Abu Hassan is in there, a lot of them will kick it over the Bureau because the Bureau, it's very clear, has primacy of place on terrorist cases. And a lot of people just don't want to be monkeying around with terrorism cases. Because if they go sideways, there's a lot of blame that comes down with them. And my experience was if people could kick a terrorism case, they would kick the terrorism case to us. But that's terrorism, right? Terrorism is pretty clear cut. Now let's take the Abu Hassan phone number out of it, and let's suppose that we've got drugs, guns, and criminal activity. It's a street gang. anybody can work that, right? The state police can come in and work it. The local PD can work it. ATF can come down and work it. DEA can come over and work it. And then it kind of boils down to, on the federal level, what the U.S. Attorney's Office is going to do. So in Vermont, for example, there wasn't a ton of dope when I was up there. There was some, but it wasn't like Miami. Right? So you weren't getting 25 kilo loads rolling into the state every other day.
Yeah.
So if you had a case that involved drugs, the U.S. Attorney's Office would encourage you to give it to the DEA, so that the DEA could keep their stats up and make some arrests and go out and do some stuff and do DEA stuff. And if there were guns involved, maybe they would push to have it over to ATF. The nice thing in Vermont, when I was there, and I have no reason to believe it's not that way any longer, was at the worker bee level, we all got along great. You watch TV and you'd think that we're all ready to have a knife fight in a phone booth every time we get together. But nothing could have been further from the truth for us when I was there. And I'm not saying that was because of me. I'm just saying that as a measure of time span, 10 years I was up there. So it was not uncommon in the summertime for a phone call to go out and say, hey, we're doing surveillance down on Church Street, which is this walk plots, if you will.
Yeah.
And it had a bunch of little outdoor restaurants and cafes. It says, hey, we're going to do surveillance at Taylor Sandwich Shop at 12 o'clock. Cool. We'll see you there. And there might be 10 people from 6 different agencies having lunch together. Because we all knew each other. We were all there for the long term. We'd worked cases together. We'd gone out and done stuff together. So that was great. And it was not uncommon for DEA to pick up the phone, for example, and say, hey, we've got to hit 6 different locations at once. We don't have enough bodies. Can you guys kick a couple bodies over? Sure thing, no problem. Now, I don't know if they still do that because liability lawyers get involved. Like, oh, you were doing a DEA case and you shot that guy. Now what are we going to do? So, I don't know if that's still the case, but it was great at the time because we just didn't fight. It was not uncommon for us to have conversations before we ever went to the U.S. Attorney's Office and say, hey, do you want to work this or we'll work it? So that was nice. There will be law standards about some things or policy standards about some things that the bosses tend to fight each other over because, of course, that all means stats and that all means promotions for them. And then there's the worker bee level. And a lot of that stuff just gets hashed out, at the worker bee level. And maybe you don't talk to the U.S. attorney about it, you talk to an assistant U.S. attorney. And, my buddy Taylor from the DEA and I and this AUSA that we both know and work with, we're all 3 going to sit down and go, hey, we got this case. We're working it jointly. How do you think we ought to go? What's the best way to tee you up for a successful prosecution? And he'll say this, that, or that. So it's not a real satisfying answer, but it's the truth. It's the best I'm going to be able to give you. And I'm sure it's in keeping with your own experiences.
So most people understand that the ATF is dealing with typical alcohol, tobacco, firearms. Most of that energy seems to be put towards firearms. And then the DEA, obviously drugs. FBI, are they more general than any of the other agencies?
Well, depending on how you define general. The FBI has, we had about 300, a little under 300 different violations that we investigated when I joined at the end of the 90s. They were up around 460, I think, by the time I had retired. So it's kind of an expanding mandate. And Congress has this I think it's a bad habit, but every time they decide, there's this new type of crime, it's got to be addressed. FBI, we're going to put this in your ballot. And the FBI then turns around and goes, okay, that's fine, but we're right straight out. We're going to need, if you want us to address that in every field office in the FBI, we have 56 field offices, we're going to need 300 more people to work this effectively nationwide. And that will cost an additional, $12 million a year or whatever. And so if you give us that money, we'll do it. And Congress goes, hey, here's your $12 million a year, but this is to fund 300 agents to work this specific project. Okay. So the FBI goes out and hires 300 more people. So their FSL, their staffing levels increase by 300, but now they've got to work that crime because that's what they're funded to work. And so you just get these layers of people that are doing that. And it was the weirdest thing because I was a salaried employee for 20 years. But I still had to keep track of my billable hours, if you will. So if I worked...
Yeah, I remember doing that. And I was like, this is so strange. I didn't do this in the Marines.
I'm like, what am I, an attorney? Okay, I 20% of my day today on this bank robbery case. And so I had to, write, 91. All right, now I'm working 50% of my case a day on this. And you had to do this every single day. For 20 years, I did that. It wasn't the end of the world. It was just a pain. But that way you can justify to Congress the bodies that you're working, the man hours that you're working, because they calculate it all up and they figure out, okay, you've overspent this much on this violation, you've underspent on this violation, fix that. And then Congress, the director of the FBI, and then the various SACs all have their priorities. And the FBI's priorities these days are mostly on counterintelligence and counterterrorism. And let's face it, 9/11 happened, and it was, I think we can all agree it was an intelligence failure on multiple agencies' parts, but you just can't let it happen again, right? I mean, if it happens again, all kinds of bad things are going to happen. And so the Bureau really put down their load on a lot of things and dove headlong into the counterterrorism and counterintelligence. They've always had the counterintelligence piece. A lot of people think the FBI is just chasing bad guys and putting them in handcuffs, but that is half of the job. The other half of the job is counterintelligence. So we chase spies, but now we're chasing terrorists. And where do they fall? Criminals, spies. Some of them are funded by nation-state actors. I don't know. So that can be a little bit of a question mark. But either way, you got to take the guys off the bank robberies and have them start working. Yeah. And in fairness, the Bureau got the mandate for bank robberies, 100 years ago. Nobody else could work. Nobody else, the local sheriff in Patuxent County, couldn't go across the state line. Right? So you used to have the criminals that all of a sudden, with the advent of the automobile, could run across state lines easily. And in effect, outrun the law. As soon as it was ollie oxen free, as soon as they got across the state line. So the Bureau came in and started working bank robberies. Well, now that's not the case, right? Now, somebody commits a bank robbery in your town, you can chase them to the ends of the earth. Across the state line, so what? I can make a phone call. I know how to do that. Those systems are in place. That education for the law enforcement officers is in place. Everybody is used to working with each other. Nobody's going, well, that was my cousin that robbed that bank down there, and therefore he's in my state now. I'm not going to chase it. Yeah. That dog doesn't hunt anymore. So do you really need the feds to work that? Maybe not. But the reality is we almost never do. So even within my career, by the time I was retiring, there were very few people that were still working violent crimes cases. It was still being worked, but only at a real macro level, real high level. And I was kind of a rarity of a guy who worked a bunch of bank robberies. Because since 9/11, that was really a dying art, if you will. Yeah. For better or for worse.
Interesting. Yeah. I think that what you said about that layering definitely sheds a lot of light on some of the bureaucracy that most people don't realize that exists in these agencies. And it's the idea that at the end, at the end of the week, you could have like a staff meeting and be like, hey, you're spending too much time on crimes. You need to spend a little bit more of your hours throughout the week on counterterrorism because of politics, literally because of budgeting and agreements that they made. That's something I don't think most people realize that it goes on, and how as an agent you are just a cog in the wheel a lot of times.
Yeah, you really are.
That's pretty much everywhere almost, but yeah, that is really interesting to think about how it works like that.
In fairness, as you become more experienced in the organization, you kind of get used to having to live in that world and deal with that bureaucratic nonsense. And, you understand intellectually, okay, look, like I was in Vermont, we had one guy who was funded 100% counterintelligence. We're in northern Vermont. You know how many spies come through northern Vermont?
A lot of Canadian spies.
Now, I will say this, spies do go skiing, right? So they do go hiking with their family. They do have time off.
Yeah, they are real people.
They are, yeah, oddly enough. But if we had a 100% effort on a bank robbery and every man on deck, right? Well, he would go. He couldn't just sit there and go, "No, bye, fellas." I mean, there was one case we had 6 agents in the office. 4 of them were on SWAT. I was new. He was old. We were the only 2 guys that weren't on SWAT. SWAT team was out of town. They were down in Binghamton or Utica or someplace. This guy robs a bank. Well, we got to respond because this was, 2000, 1999, something like that. Well, he's not a bank robbery guy, right? He's a counterintelligence guy.
Yeah.
Chasing the Mossad and the Chinese and the Russians. He doesn't. Fingerprints? I remember that from the academy. That was 15 years ago. So the 2 of us had to go out and work it. Now, how does he then, what we called Turk, right? It was time utilization record keeping. Didn't know I still remember that. So how did he Turk his day? Well, I don't know. I didn't ask, right? That was between him and the supervisor. So yeah, you got to jump through those hoops, but you get used to it and you figure out ways around workarounds. I mean, it's annoying that you have to figure out a ways around it, work around it, but you do. Because that's just the reality. And I remember times when my boss would tell me, "Hey, look, you're working X too much, work Y," and I'm like, "Boss, I'd love to, but I work the cases you give me. So either you're telling me not to do what you tell me to do, or you're telling me to lie on an official government document. Pick one."
Yeah.
Of course, he had many ways to voice his displeasure if I, didn't do what I was not told to do.
Do you think a similar situation to what you were just talking about, where you have people that are not trained in whatever specialty it is they're being called to act in? I've been hearing a lot of reports from this Trump assassination attempt that seems to be the case, where you had agents or Secret Service agents that were not specifically trained in PSD that were assigned to that detail. Do you know anything about, or not, obviously, not inside information, but have you heard anything about that? And can you maybe give your opinion on some of that?
I haven't heard anything specifically about that case, but I frankly have been kind of avoiding hearing specifics about that case. But I can speak a little bit about that as an outsider who had some experience dealing with the Secret Service, as a fellow professional, if you will. The Secret Service has a mandate to do their protection details, as everyone knows. So they protect the president, his family, the vice president, his family, specific visiting dignitaries. But most of the dignitary protection work falls under the Department of State. They have their own dignitary protection people, and they do the majority of that. Mm-hmm. So the Secret Service has a very specific mandate of which I do not know the intimate details. So I'm not the guy to speak to. But one of their mandates is to protect former presidents, right? So Jimmy Carter, 4 years in office and then 40 years of protectee status, unless he gives it up. He can give that. But in addition to that, there's 2,500 Secret Service agents when I was in. I'm sure the number's gone up. But when they're not doing that, they have a mandate about currency and counterfeit. And they conduct investigations and work cases and put people in prison just like any other federal agency.
Right.
The problem comes in when an election year hits. Because as soon as keep in mind, I've been out for 8 years. The specifics of this may have changed. But as soon as you are running for president and you meet the threshold for federal matching funds, where the federal government is going to help fund your campaign to the tune of however much money you get in on your own, one of the perks of that is you now are considered a serious candidate and you get Secret Service protection. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of these guys, Secret Service protection is a status symbol, right? They don't really need it, but I'm a serious player because I've got these Secret Service guys. Obviously, President Trump needed it. Well, in an election year, everybody who meets that standard gets details. Well, those details have to come from somewhere. They're coming from the Secret Service. They're not coming off of the presidential detail, right? The president gets the A team, right? Those are the guys that are in there swinging all the time. The other folks get lesser tier agents, still dedicated, still well trained, not SEAL Team 6, right? They're just not. So my guess is President Trump's detail, he's not working with the presidential detail anymore. He's working with a former presidential detail. It's going to be smaller. It's going to be more streamlined. It's going to be less well-resourced. I've heard rumors that it was under-resourced to the tune that the people on the detail were screaming for additional help. I don't know if that's true or not. When they go out and they campaign places, there may be a situation where you have full-time guys assigned to them all the time who are then rounded out by agents that are within a state or two, and they say, hey, look, you're going to come up. President Trump is doing a whistle stop in XYZ, Pennsylvania. You need to come up, and for the next 5 days, you're going to be on that detail. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that's just part of being in the Secret Service. You pack your bag, you go up there, and, everybody's on the same playbook. Everybody went to the same, Glencoe. They all went through the Secret Service Academy. They all have a certain level of training.
Right.
But just like you always hear, every Marine is a rifleman. Yeah, they've all been trained that way. But if you're a rifleman and then 18 years later, you've spent all that time as a cook, yeah, maybe you're not at the same level as a guy who spent that same 18 years in the infantry.
Yeah, skills are perishable.
They're perishable. They rust. They get some dust on them. I don't know that happened in this case. If President Trump's team had been rounded out by others, then I see a potential for miscommunication.
Mm-hmm.
The use of the locals in that case, that's pretty standard. It's very much an onion approach to protection. You've got the close people and the next level, the next level, the next level. When you got to a certain point, depending on geography and just staffing, you're going to need help. And so they push out that bubble, and at a certain point, it's just the local officers. And what they'll do is they'll tell a local commander, a local chief, local sheriff, hey, we're going to be here. We need 35 bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And that's based on the Secret Service's own rubric. And that guy will either pull them out of his own staffing, or if, small PD, most likely he's going to have to say, hey, we got this TDY opportunity to come down and work on, for these 5 days with President Trump's campaign. He's coming in to do a thing on this day. And people will volunteer, right? I mean, they'll do it for pay. They'll do it because they want to be near that particular presidential candidate, whatever. And they come in. So now you've got maybe 5 or 6 different agencies, maybe 10 agencies, maybe one. But there's attendant friction points in there. And they've got to communicate with the Secret Service. And in this case, I'm sure it was seen as a very low threat environment. It wasn't like they were going to Beirut, right? They're going to a rural county in Pennsylvania. Of course, in my head, having been in Vermont for 10 years, everybody in Vermont's got a deer rifle. I mean, frickin' everybody in Vermont's got a deer rifle. They could have a Dukakis sticker on the back of their car, and they're still got a deer rifle, okay? So, you roll into rural Pennsylvania, you can assume everybody's got a rifle. But there's a lot of points of friction there, and especially if you're not looking at it as a high-threat environment, it's real easy. And I'm not saying it happened here, but it's real easy to get complacent. Mm-hmm. It's real easy to say, you know what? Locals got that. We got this.
Well, and the last time we had an attempted assassination was how many years ago?
Yeah, well, I was.
And people say it's like, oh, well, you shouldn't think. It's like there are so many things in your daily life that same thing applies. Like, when's the last time a wheel fell off an airplane flying over your head and like landed on someone's car? It's like, I don't know. I'm sure it's happened at some, like, gear has fallen off of a plane, but I don't operate my day thinking. Actually, I take that back. Sometimes I have thought to myself, like, I wonder if something fell off that plane right now, like what at like 30,000 feet. But
to your point,
but there's
a greater than zero chance, right?
Yes. But there's so many things that it's more complex than just straight conspiracy, right? Could there be conspiratorial elements? I'm sure there can be, but it's not as Brad Thor as I think a lot of people would want it to be.
Brad Thor, no.
It's not. I love his novels, but it's not, or as Alex Jones maybe would describe it as. I think that that's like something I want to talk to you next about is you mentioned stats in a previous, and I remember that term stats. Your arrest stats and all that type of stuff, and just like any other job, right? Just like being in sales or marketing or whatever, you have certain metrics of success, and those metrics of success determine whether or not you're going to get promoted to the next level. And in law enforcement, those metrics of success typically are arrests. They typically are cases, putting bad people away. And it's just natural. It's just how it is, right? That's how we measure ourselves in the competence hierarchy in law enforcement, just like any other industry. But in this case in particular, this, again, I don't have all the details on this. I've kind of been listening to it just to stay abreast of it as I can. But I heard some reports that they had already known about this person and possibly had been in contact with this person. And again, this is getting in. I'm not trying to get into the conspiracy level things. I'm just trying to say how I could see this happening in a way that's not necessarily nefarious. And the way is this idea where, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's cases where you'll be in contact with someone who's a known criminal element or a known criminal, and they will, for lack of a better term, like not grooming necessarily. I think that's the word that's being thrown around, but you will contact that person, particularly like child crimes, right? They'll email this person back and forth and get them to say things that they can then use to prosecute them later on. And my thought is, okay, if you combine this idea of the stats motive, which is we want to get arrests, we want particularly these types of arrests, right? That would be a massive arrest to be able to arrest someone who was planning to assassinate a former president. And I don't know if they're contacting him or not, but let's say they were messaging this guy in some back forum or whatever. At what point do you go from just getting information on this person to that message you sent them? That was what tipped them over the edge, right? And I don't know how often that happens, but I can see the way the system is structured and the motives are structured that it could lend itself to that. And it not even be nefarious. It be, well, you have to contact this person to get information on what they're doing, and you have to earn their trust. And in order to earn someone's trust, you have to play a certain part and a certain role. And that role could be someone who agrees with them and who is to some extent encouraging them. Now, I know we can't do necessarily entrapment, but what are your thoughts on some of that? I know that was kind of a mix of different things, but I can't buy into these. First of all, I know how dysfunctional government is. And so they're extremely dysfunctional in the sense of trying to do things the right way, which also means that they're probably going to be just as dysfunctional doing some conspiracy. The number of people involved are just, it's not going to work. So I attribute most of it to unintentional consequences. These devices reset your trigger after each shot so that you can dry fire just like you live fire in semi-auto. Plus, the Blackbeard fires a laser out of the bore so that you can track your shots and work on height over bore offset for close engagements. And the Blackbeard X uses an accelerometer to track and analyze the motion of your gun on their Mantis X app. Even the United States Marine Corps saw the training value in the Blackbeard X and began to utilize these devices in basic training. So now Marine Corps marksmanship coaches can analyze recruit shooting performance using the Blackbeard in order to make them better shooters. So stop wasting time with traditional dry fire. Order yourself a Blackbeard or Blackbeard X today and start training to a higher standard.
Yeah, I never attribute things to conspiracy that can be easily explained away by incompetence and ignorance.
Yeah.
Just because, Occam's razor dictates that it's probably the simplest thing, and the simplest thing is, probably someone screwed up. Error. As far as getting people or pushing people over the edge, is it a sociological concern? Certainly. Is it a tactical level concern when I'm going out to talk to somebody? Only in as much as I don't want them to shoot me.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that because if you got to talk to somebody, you got to talk to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
If you have solid reasons to talk to them, then you got to talk to them. And if that's what pushes their button, then I'm not going to say that that's my fault.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say that, you ever see the movie Grosse Pointe Blank? A long time ago, it came out about. It's about a hitman played by John Cusack. But one of the things he says, look, if I show up on your door, chances are really good you did something to bring me. And that's absolutely true with the FBI. We just don't have the time or the personnel. I mean, we had, 12,000 agents in that organization when I was in. We have the time to spy on every American and go after and gin up some criminal activity. And from being a cop, you don't have to you don't have to, go fishing. You just got to kill the fish that jump in the boat.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the ones that are going in the bag because people just are relentless about screwing up. So when it comes time to talk to a guy, and you see this a lot, this has happened an awful lot, where it comes out after the fact, somebody pops their cork and they shoot a presidential candidate. They go hands-on with a gymnastics team in the Midwest. Mm-hmm. They shoot up a school. And then it comes to light, hey, the FBI, they were on the FBI's radar. I've heard that phrase so many times. The FBI knew about this guy. Okay. Well, that may technically be true. But what ends up happening, and you know this, a lot of people you talk to, they're nefarious in some way, shape, or form. Maybe they've got a criminal history, maybe they don't. Does that mean you get to arrest them right now because you got a gut feeling? No.
They still have constitutional rights.
Right. That pesky Constitution gets in the way sometimes, darn it. And thank God it does, right? Because it keeps a lot of people that shouldn't be in jail out of jail. But does that mean that, hey, we've got some questions? Well, that's what an investigation is, right? Hey, you put this up on social media, and in this society that we're in now, this time that we're in now, we got to come out and talk to you. We got to find out, try to get a sense of what's going on in your head. Are you going to hurt somebody? If you say yes, well, that's one conversation.
Yeah.
But of course, typically when two guys dressed like me show up at your house and say, hi, I'm with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Can I talk to you a little bit? All of a sudden the shit just got real, right? You're like, Lord. Yeah, we noticed that you posted this thing on social media that said you wanted to shoot up your school. Can you explain that? Oh, I was just talking. There's nothing. Okay. Well, look, at that point, you haven't broken a law, right? And I've come out and talked to you, and what did you say? I wasn't going to do it. I was just talking. I don't have a gun. I don't even like guns. Okay, can I arrest you? No.
Mm-mm.
Next week, can you get a gun and go shoot up your school? Yeah. And then can we arrest you? Sure. And then it comes out when you're being interviewed by the local police officer that you really like because he's a really nice fella. Yeah, I talked to the FBI 2 weeks ago. Well, what hits the media? Oh, the FBI talked to this guy 2 weeks before.
He was on the FBI's radar.
Yeah, he was on the FBI's radar. And it's absolutely true. But hey, folks, newsflash. You can't get arrested just because you said something stupid.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's very frustrating because I've gone out and talked to people and walked out of the interview talking to my partner going, that guy is going to kill himself or somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
No doubt in my mind it's going to happen. And then when it happens, you all stand around going, well, there's nothing we can do. We sent the information. And a lot of times what I would do is I would send the extra information. I'd go the extra mile, contact the local psychological services folks. A lot of times the best way to go was talk to the local cops. Because the FBI simply doesn't have that kind of intimate relationship with social services that local officers will have. Because the local officers are always on the pointy end of that particular spear, where, look, incarceration isn't necessarily the right answer for this guy. This guy needs to talk to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
This guy needs shelter. Or this guy needs food. This guy needs something that is not in the law enforcement ballot. And so those local officers will oftentimes know who to call. Hey, I got this problem. Who do I call? Call Bob down at the local PD. Yeah, I got a guy. And you can do it that way. I've done that before. But I've also had people come in and talk to me on Friday that I knew needed help. And before they got help, went home and hung themselves.
Yeah.
That experience a couple times. So it's very frustrating because you want to do the right thing. You want to stop the crime, right? You want to help the guy that needs help. But sometimes you just can't. It just doesn't happen. And then, of course, what happens later is it comes out in the media. You got to deal with it that way.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I get that. Like, obviously going to the house, investigating the person, you got your clipboard, you're identifying yourself as law enforcement. My question was more related to, and I don't know the extent of how this is used, but the posing as someone else, like either online and an online forum and those types of formats.
Sure.
I just wondered if, hey, we have this person and it's like, oh, we know this person is probably going to do something. Let's get them, earn their trust and get them to say something or admit to something because they think we're one of their ilk and they will admit to this if we get. I've just wondered if that level of earning trust can push someone over the edge.
Well, and I can't speak to other people's motivations, obviously.
Yeah.
People, they do. I mean, how many times did you see law enforcement career after the fact? You're looking at the guy going, "What the hell were you thinking?"
Yeah.
Right? You're just like, what?
Yeah.
And I don't like to say that we get them to do things or we get them to say things, right? So an online undercover operation, no different than an in-person undercover operation. You can't go to a guy and say, sell me some dope. Hey, go get some dope and buy some dope. Please, I'll buy some dope. Go get me some dope. You can't pester someone into selling you dope.
Mm-hmm.
But if somebody walks up to you and says, hey, you want to buy a key? And you go, okay. And they show up with a key and you arrest them, that they were predisposed to that criminal activity and you just gave it a place to go. When it comes to online predation, there I have some experience with arresting those guys. And that literally is fishing out of the bottom of your boat. Because all you have to do is set up a profile that, hey, I'm a 11-year-old boy in a broken home and I'm just looking for a friend. And if you're in the right chat room, I've seen it, I've done it, I've watched it happen where you just start getting DMs or IMs, ping, 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 and you open 30 cases in 10 minutes. It's insanity. And these guys are sending pictures of themselves. And the one nice thing about working those crimes, and I'm sure you had similar experiences, when you're working a dope crime and a doper says, I'm going to show up 6:00, your place, with a kilo of cocaine. Have the cash. Okay. He's calling you at 8:00. Yeah, I got delayed. My old lady's car broke down. And it's not going to be a whole key. It's going to be an 8-ball. I had some problems, my splier. And what does he do? He shows up at midnight with a dime bag of oregano, right? Guys, and it tends to be guys that are focused on children. If you tell them, hey, I get off the school bus at 3:15 and I'm a latchkey kid, so I'll be in my house at 3:20 by myself, they'll be sitting in the parking lot across the street from your bus stop at 3:05 with a bag of what we can collectively call evidence of their intent, and they're hopping from foot to foot, right? I mean, it's literally arrest by appointment with those guys.
Oh my gosh.
So when you're working those kind of undercovers, you don't really have to say anything to get them to trust you. You just have to listen to them talk, and just talk like a little kid. That's literally all you have to do, and then you'll just be able to document the grooming process. Because little kids, if you put yourself in the mindset of a little kid, they simply don't have the experience. They just don't have the life experience. They're just as motivated to do crazy shit as the rest of us, but they don't have the depth of knowledge and intelligence based on that experience that an adult does. You walk into a bar at 2 a.m, last call, you walk up to a good-looking woman and say, "Hey, you are the most beautiful, intelligent woman I've ever seen in my life. I could just stand here and listen to you for hours." You know exactly what you're trying to accomplish. She knows exactly what you're trying to accomplish, right? Because you're both adults and you have the life experience to put that conversation into that context of where you are and what's going on, to understand what's happening here. And she's making all kinds of decisions as to how she's going to respond to that conversation based on her intended outcome, right? And so are you. Well, when you take that same conversation and you put it into the hands of a child and an adult, it's Little League T-ball versus, the New York Yankees. It's not the same thing. So when I'm talking as a kid, I don't have to have great intellectual leaps of innuendo or anything else. I just have to let it happen. And so there's really not a whole lot of making them do something. When it comes to adult conversations about terrorism or more generalized criminal conspiracy, I think that's where your question really can be more intelligently applied, right? Because that's a place where there's an expected to and fro amongst adults. And so that's why you have specially trained people that do undercover cases, right? Because they're not only trained in acting and thespianism, but they're trained in, hey, this is where the rules say you can go, and this is where the rules say you can't go. And if you go past that line, the whole case gets scrapped. And because that's obviously the penalty for overstepping, right?
Fruit of the poisonous tree.
Everything becomes a fruit of the poisonous tree. You got a Fourth Amendment issue, bye-bye. It all goes away. And no cop worth their salt wants their case to go away, right? If I'm on you, then I'm going to work it. Now, does that mean I'm going to make stuff up? No. And if you are making stuff up, do you need to get got? Yeah, you do. Am I going to lie? No. Am I going to try my level best to work this case within the bounds of the law? Absolutely. Absolutely. And let's not forget, you don't get to arrest them, try them, and incarcerate them all on your own. Right? You're part of a system. So every day that you meet with that person as an undercover, whether it's online or in person, you're talking to your boss. Everything that you get from every conversation is going to be reviewed by you, your boss, and probably the prosecutor.
Right.
You're all going to make these decisions. You got to get a warrant in this process, or 2 or 5 or 10. Everything you've got has got to go in front of that judge. Maybe you're putting it in front of a grand jury now. So now there's 10, 20, 30 people sitting on that grand jury that have to agree with you that there's at least probable cause to take this to trial. And if some point in there you develop information that says, nope, not a crime, then you're supposed to get off the train. It may be frustrating, may be aggravating, because you're like, you know what, this guy's dirty. He's just not dirty this time. Well, then you got to go get him another time, because you can't get him this time. But by the time you actually go put bracelets on someone, especially at the federal level, there's a whole lot of people that have had their fingers on that pot. A whole lot of checks and balances. And you haven't even convicted him yet, right? You just arrested him. I think that's why you have so many appellate court cases that come out of local officers. It's not because they're bad officers, they're bad at their job. It's because they're making these decisions in the moment with incomplete information based on their best understanding of the law. And it's looked at by 30 other people, including people who are motivated to make sure you're wrong.
The arrest is made based off of generally one perspective as opposed to the number of perspectives at the federal level.
So getting people to say things I don't use that phrase. I say, look, I'm going to talk and you're going to say what you're going to say. And I'm going to say what I'm going to say, and all of it's going to be open for scrutiny after the fact. Your attorney's going to put me on the stand, and I'm going to have notes. I'm going to have my FD 302. It memorializes that every single meeting we've had. And then the jury's going to decide what the facts were, and then the judge is going to decide what an appropriate disposition of the case is. I was never one to get really emotionally involved about my cases. I mean, don't get me wrong. especially those kid cases, a lot of them pissed me off.
Yeah.
A lot of them really pissed me off. But in my head, the best way to get vengeance for that kid was to coldly go about my job and do what I could, because the federal penalties were just so draconian.
Mm-hmm.
They were just vicious. And the best thing I could do is not let my emotions screw up that investigation, and do it lawfully and do it legally so that it met the scrutiny, with its head held high. And then you're going to end up where you need to be. It's my opinion.
Yeah. What years did you work for the FBI?
I joined in 97 and I retired the last day of 17.
Okay. Going back to the question on like conspiracy, complacency, corruption type thing, like obviously the FBI has been in the news a lot recently, particularly as it relates to lawfare and partisanship. Can you speak to that? Do you think that, I mean, obviously there's, depending on what news agency you watch, like they're going to have their own spin, and there's like truth and then there's the truth. Can you speak to that a little bit and say, like, have you noticed a change since back when you started to now? Is it more politicized? Is that whole lawfare thing, is there credence to that?
I think that we, as a society, absolutely have to be aware of that potential, and we have to make sure it doesn't happen. Because look, the FBI is one of dozens of federal agencies, and I can speak to the FBI. It's got way too much power to be allowed to be a political tool.
Mm-hmm.
It just can't. It can't happen. It cannot happen, because if it does, you end up with a Gestapo. And I feel like the Nazi equivalency is way overused in sort of general conversation.
Yeah.
Look at any tyrannical government in history. Every one of them has had their secret police, has had their unfettered law enforcement organization. And, the Nazis, everything they did was legal.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They were very, very diligent about passing laws and then enforcing.
Yep.
They didn't just capriciously go out and do things. They passed capricious laws, but once they were on the books, then their police force could legitimately go out and do stuff. I think we need to be very, very careful about allowing any law enforcement agency to get off the reservation in that way, to politicizing any law enforcement agency. I think when you had accusation that the IRS was being weaponized, I think it needed to be aired out, right? There's no disinfectant like daylight.
Mm-hmm.
If that's the suggestion, then you need to start dragging people in front of Congress, and if need be, dragging them into courtrooms and
Mm-hmm.
hammering that out. Because you cannot operate as a law enforcement agency in this country at any level without the trust of those you are policing.
Mm-hmm.
You just can't. And you know that. You're the local PD, you couldn't operate if the locals didn't like you.
Right.
If they wouldn't talk to you, right? Because the TV shows don't show it very well, but you and I both know that the lifeblood of any law enforcement agency is the public and the communication with the public. And that only happens if they trust you. So you cannot lose that trust.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that you're asking about lawfare, which, as I understand the term, and let's make sure we're both talking about the same thing here, is the weaponization of legal entities to extract, personal vendettas or political. It seems to be political vendettas.
Yeah, particularly double standards with prosecuting people of certain political affiliations and not others that are not maybe the exact same crime, but ones that typically would be prosecuted at the same level.
Right. And I think you have a perception problem. Whether it's true or not is important, but ignoring the perception is critically erroneous.
Mm-hmm.
You can't ignore that. And when you do things like send a search warrant team to the home of a former president to serve a warrant and search for documents, you need to be very circumspect about that. And it cracked me up when the White House and the Attorney General kind of shrugged and went, "What? They went out there? We had no idea they were going out there." I'm like, buddy, come on.
Yeah.
Come on. I can't investigate a local mayor as a police officer or as an FBI agent. If I'm going to search...
You can't even pull them over without that going all the way to the top.
Right. He rolled a stop sign, and tell me your chief didn't know about it that afternoon. Okay, if I'm going into the home of a local police chief or a local mayor, it's going to go all the way up to Department of Justice.
Mm-hmm.
It just is, period. I'm not speculating. That's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I've had cases on public corruption targets who were political figures at the state level, and it went to the Attorney General's minions.
Probably by lunch if it was in the morning.
Yeah. So, I'm not saying the Attorney General weighed in on that particular case. But what I am saying is if that's happening to the mayor of Winooski, Vermont or some crazy thing like that, you kind of try and tell me that anybody anywhere is going to serve a precedent-setting warrant on a former president of the United States and not tell his boss, you're high as a kite.
Mm-hmm.
That would have been, as soon as that came across my desk, it would have gone right to my boss. It would have gone to his boss. It would have been on the SAC's office. I'd have been in there talking to the SAC within 20 minutes if he was in the building. And he'd be on the phone to Main Justice that moments later. Period.
Mm-hmm.
Period.
Yeah.
So to do that on one president and then turn around, within 6 months and do it on a sitting president? Holy crap. And then they come up with the idea that, we're going to prosecute this guy and we're not going to prosecute that guy. Look, you may very well have good reasons for doing it. Right? I'm not intimately involved in the cases. I have opinions about that, and I struggle to kind of rationalize that. But okay, I'm going to grant you that you have a good reason for it.
Yeah.
But if you don't address the perception issue there, you're wrong. Okay, because there is absolutely a perception issue there. Hands down, period. And then when you come up with we're not going to prosecute this guy because he's too old and decrepit. He's the sitting president. He's too old and decrepit to defend himself in court, but he's not too old and decrepit to make a decision about launching nuclear missiles on Moscow?
Oh my gosh.
Come on. I mean, and so look, again, you may have good reasons for that. I don't see them. I don't see it.
Yeah.
So make me aware. Educate me. Spend some time educating the public. Because if you don't, what that ends up doing is it undermines faith in the entire system.
Yeah.
Including faith in the law enforcement agency that's at the center of all of this. And you can't have that in this country.
No.
It's not the country we're in. Not the country I want to live in. Not the country you want to live in.
Yeah. Well, that's so important what you said about the perception problem, more so than the lawfare element, but also with what we saw in COVID. Because regardless of what position you have on COVID, it cannot be denied that the trust in institutions, particularly health institutions, is absolutely demolished now.
It is.
And even if, like what you just said, even if you had good reason to, or they had good reason to say certain things, to overinflate numbers or underinflate numbers, or whatever the case may be, again, it doesn't matter. We can't deny that the distrust has been at an all-time high. And the problem I see with that is, okay, what's going to happen if we have an actual serious, and again, this is, some people will say, well, COVID was like the worst thing. Okay. What if we have something that's like Ebola or bubonic plague level, and all of a sudden they come out and you see them talking about it? Half of the country is going to say, or maybe even more, is going to say, yeah, okay, we've seen this before. And what type of problem is that going to create where now people don't trust you? And so it's going to be a delay in response or delay in people taking it seriously. And how many people are going to die because last time you wanted to do whatever you wanted to do and now people don't trust you anymore? And so, yeah, that's and on both sides too, right? It's I don't like the idea of just completely wholesale saying the whole thing is corrupt. I think that the whole thing is full of people, and people are people. And there's obviously people, I think, at the top that maybe make certain decisions that the ones at the lower levels get thrown into the same category as those. But yeah, the lack of trust we have right now is a massive, massive problem. And like I said, whether it's perception, whether or not it's true, it doesn't matter. What matters is that the perception is there. And
people don't seem to be paying attention to perception management.
No.
They really
don't.
And
No.
Look, our society, at least in my lifetime, is at a low point in terms of trust of the government. But I look at people have been throwing rocks at the government since Watergate. We've been talking about reasons not to trust the government for 50 years. Trust in our media, all-time low, right? I mean, think about your own. I don't know the first thing about where you get your media information, but my guess is, like so many other people, you're either picking the propaganda you want to hear, left or right, or you're listening to people from overseas. You're going to multiple different media sources to try and suss out the truth, or at least the the truth that's being published.
I just listen to MSNBC all day long. That's all I listen to. If you couldn't tell,
yeah.
Don't I just seem like someone?
I know people that say, "Look, I'm watching CNN, and that's all they watch," or "I'm watching Fox, and that's all they watch."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But most of us at this point are just like, "Look, either side is unmitigated propaganda."
Yeah.
So pick the propaganda you want to hear.
Yeah.
Or in my case, I just watch SpongeBob. It's about this. I mean, there's real trust issues. There's real problems there. And if I'm a nation state actor with ill intent towards the United States, maybe I've been funding this for 50 years. Right? Because we do that to other countries, right? We want to undermine another country. Well, that's what we do. We fund the opposition. We pump money into the opposing viewpoints on their network, their media network. So we build a radio station just over the border in the country next door that broadcasts propaganda into that nation. I mean, we do the same thing. So there's no reason to expect that, the CCP or the Russians or the North Koreans or the Iranians just aren't doing the exact same thing to us. Just pumping the money in here. But it's working. It's working. I look at this upcoming election, for example, and I try to figure out how we get through it without violence on the other end. And I don't know that we can, because as we saw the last time around, when the left lost, they took to the streets for months on it. I mean, you had entire sections of Seattle that were taken over. The police just couldn't go there, including when there was a murder. They just basically threw the body out of their little compound and just gave it up. Portland burned forever. And then we saw the right starting to get on board. Right, the right started to respond, which, as you said earlier, people are people. Right, they're going to respond. And if law enforcement isn't going to stop my town from burning, then me and my homies down the street are going to stop my town from burning. And you're going to see things like January 6th. You can call it whatever you want to call it, but the fact is, a bunch of right-leaning folk got together and did illegal stuff. They shouldn't. So I look at this next election. I go, okay, let's say candidate A wins. Candidate B supporters are going to take to the streets. I don't see how some of them don't get violent. I don't see how we're not going to start seeing these idiots in the roadways again, blocking the highways, and we're not going to see sections of town. Not my president, whether the sign is in red ink or blue ink is kind of immaterial to me if I'm stuck in the riot.
Yeah.
I just don't see which side wins in this election that doesn't result in the other side rioting. And that's not the country we want to live in. That's not the nation that most of us grew up in. But that's what we've had for the last decade. And I don't see how we get out of it. And I don't see the next election down the pipe, in 4 years, how we don't get closer to having on one side an honest-to-God, unrepentant communist, and on the other side an honest-to-God, unrepentant Nazi, nationalist, socialist. I see us going in those two directions. I see foreign nations with plenty of opportunity to encourage that behavior, because they can't beat us in the field. Right? Nobody's going to take on the U.S. military and win. Nobody on the planet is going to do it. So how do you beat the U.S.? Well, there's other ways.
From within.
Really, this one's effective.
Yeah.
I don't know what the solution is. Buy more rain barrels, freeze-dried food, more 22 ammo. I don't know, because none of us want to live that way.
Yeah.
The vast majority of us don't. But what choice are we being given here? These two major parties continue to put up further and further fringe elements. They keep applying their efforts to appease the fringe elements of their electorate, of their party, leaving a lot of us in the middle behind. Where does that end up? No place good, that's for sure.
No. Yeah, I think of it like a domestic, particularly with the violence. Domestics usually continue to get worse and worse and worse and worse, absent some intervention that takes place. The first call is just a little shoving, the next call, some hitting, and then eventually it could get up to murder. And I kind of see the same thing with both sides and the way they fight. And whenever one's not unhappy, the type of retaliation or type of outcry that they had just seems to get worse and worse and worse every year in this election cycle. Like you said, either way, I don't see how it doesn't get really, really bad.
And it drives me bonkers because these politicians make these decisions not based on what's best for the country. They used to hide it behind that veil. Oh, we're making decisions best of our perception, best for the country, or what our constituents want. but they're making decisions based on what's best for them. How do I keep this job? Buddy, it's just a job. I mean, it may be a cool job. It's just a job. You were looking for work when you found this job. Find another one. You're somebody who's transitioned professions. It's not the end of the world. Is it tough? Yeah. But my God, are you willing to burn the nation down so you can keep your job, so you can motivate your constituents to donate an extra $10? Because that's what they're trying to do. They want to get reelected, and that means money. So I need money. How do I get money? How do I motivate my constituents? Well, scare tactic seems to be the chosen approach, and it works. I'm sure your viewers have the same experience I do. Every time I get an envelope that says NRA on the front, it's sky is falling inside the envelope, right? Oh my God, we're in the fight of our lives. We could all write that letter from memory.
Yeah.
This election matters. Oh my God, we need your money. We need your support.
Yeah.
And that's what both sides are doing. And it works, right? It absolutely works. The problem is it's burning up the place in the process.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just having a polite conversation about a political topic is increasingly difficult, especially if you're talking to somebody who doesn't agree with you.
Right.
I mean, it's really, really hard. Now, when I was a kid, you didn't talk about politics, religion, or your wives in front of people. Right? That was just polite company. That's not what you do. Right? You used to go, you'd vote, and you got on with your life. That was it.
Yeah.
Not anymore. Well, as soon as they find out you're voting for A, or you're voting for B, or you're one of them, one of those people. And now, you're not invited back to Thanksgiving dinner next year. Right?
Yeah.
You voted for the wrong person.
Yeah.
We got to come back from that edge. We got to back off of that.
Funny enough, I actually think it's harder to have conversations with people who maybe you agree with on more things, like maybe say you vote for candidate A and that other person votes for candidate A, but they believe in maybe certain conspiracies that you think are complete BS. And to have maybe more of a nuanced reason, at least try to have more of a nuanced reasoned conversation about it. It's like that. I feel like that's almost more difficult than it is just to have a conversation with someone that's just on an opposite side who is at least like, okay, we can talk about this. And
you're wrong,
I don't know.
I'm right, but we'll move forward.
Yeah, but the moment you start saying stuff that makes that person think like, maybe you're not in my tribe. Maybe you're not
Democrat enough. You're not Republican enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those conversations almost are more difficult. But
yeah, they can be. You're right. And how do we get to this extremist point? I mean, how do we get where comedians are holding up effigies of the president or a presidential candidate's head chopped off, covered in blood? Yeah, how do we?
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah.
I mean, how? How do we get to the point where politicians are standing out in front of courthouses screaming for the conviction of the person on the inside? And if he's not convicted, they're in Wisconsin, we're going to burn this place down. I'm like, aren't you from California? What are you doing? What the hell are you doing, lady?
Yeah.
And I'm just picking on those particular incidents because they come to mind, but both sides are guilty of this. I don't want to sound like I'm being, sparing one side the rod.
Although, if I had to say, I'll say it. It seems like one side is more verbose when it comes to calling out for violence than the other side.
Yeah, and that may well be a good thing, because I think if I looked at both sides, the side that isn't talking as much smack is probably the more dangerous of the two.
And the more armed.
Yeah, it's probably a little bit more heavily armed.
Yeah.
Probably a lot more people that have real experience with violence on that side of the fence.
Mm-hmm.
So when that side of the fence really starts talking about violence, it's time to start digging holes in sandbags.
Yeah, I definitely disagree in the actions that took place on January 6th. However, I will say that if it was a true attempt to take over, they didn't seem to bring the things that would have given them the advantage. And so it kind of lends itself to like, was this really, or were they just acting stupid?
And right back to, is it conspiracy or is it dumb?
Yeah.
Well, because I gotta admit, if I was going to an insurrection, I probably wouldn't just take a hat and a camera.
Right.
I'd probably have other tools at my disposal.
Yeah.
That's just me. What do I know?
Well, speaking of what do you know, let's talk about that book behind you, Empathy for the Devil. That's your recent book, right? Yeah, it's right there.
There it is, yeah. I don't know why I'm doing that. I got a whole case of them on the floor right here. There we go. Aha! Empathy for the Devil. Yeah, that's it. Available in fine Amazon near you. Sure. What would you like to hear about Empathy for the Devil?
What were your motivations to write it, and can you briefly give a synopsis of what it talks about? Have an idea, but for the viewer.
Well, I was while I was in the FBI, I had an opportunity to go to Guantanamo Bay and serve as an interrogator in the early days of the GWAT, the Global War on Terror. So in 2003, I went down and spent my summer vacation in Cuba. So I was down there for a few months, and in that time, I interrogated, I want to say somewhere between 45 and 60 honest to God, real world terrorists. And so I wrote a book about it. And what motivated me to write the book, honestly, was the thought that my experience wasn't unique. It was fairly rare. There were other agents that were down there, but I think it needed to be recorded in some level. Now, am I the best person to do that? Probably not. But am I the only person that's doing it from the FBI perspective so far? I hope others that were down there write books as well. That'd be great. Because I think in 100 years, I hope they're still talking about what we did in Guantanamo Bay, because I really think that that's important for the U.S. Because the next time this comes up, and there will be a next time, they need to make their decisions based on the information they have. At the time, it was a whole new thing, right? Nobody had ever experienced what we'd experienced. Nobody had to sort of deal with it. And so a lot of stuff was made up on the fly, and responses to immediate input. And like any adult will know that sometimes that works out great and sometimes it doesn't. But you have that experience, so let's record the experience. So I started looking for books about Guantanamo Bay by people who'd been there, and they were almost all written by people who'd been locked up in Guantanamo. And they all had a very common level of experience and response to sort of the Guantanamo Bay experience. And they had a lot of things to say that were from their perspective, and I get that. I read one from a guard and a translator who'd been down there, a military guy who translated for one of the languages, who also had kind of an agenda. But nobody had written from the perspective of someone who's actually sitting in the chair talking to the terrorists and talking to those accused of terrorism, because some of them weren't terrorists at all. And so I thought, well, let's get that written down. Now, the limiting factor, of course, is a lot of those conversations, a lot of the individuals by name, it's all classified. So I can't write it. I can't say, I talked to Abu Taylor. That just can't happen. And this is what he said, and this is what I said. None of that. But what I can tell you is things like, if there was torture going on, I didn't see it. Okay, a lot of the interrogators down there, I would say the majority of the interrogators down there were FBI. Now, were there other people from other agencies? Yes, there were. But the lion's share of that load was being carried by the FBI. And so I think that lends a commonality of experience between me and a lot of other people. And I think that needs to be recorded. And, Rich Brown put it really well. He said that he would love to read a memoir from somebody who was a guard at Andersonville in the Civil War, that was watching the prisoners at Andersonville. And that just doesn't exist. And so as a historian, he's like, I would like to read that. So it occurred to me, I was like, you know what? I'm going to write that and, throw it out there and see what happens. And that's why I wrote it. That was my motivation to write. And what I did was I took my journal that I kept at the time. I kept a diary while I was there. And I translated it into it. Now, it's a lot of, I think it really makes the point that, it was time to make the donuts, right? It was very get up in the morning, do some PT, have some breakfast, do some reading, drive out, pick up my translator, drive out to the compound, make my way through the security, sit down, and talk to a guy. Maybe he talks to me, maybe he doesn't. And then go to lunch, come back in the afternoon, go home, come back the next day. In that regard, it was factory work.
Yeah.
Which, to your earlier point, a lot of people don't think of it in those terms. You think of all kinds of other stuff, depending on
Zero Dark 30.
Yeah.
Most people go to that.
Wet phone books and waterboarding people.
Yeah.
And that just didn't happen. I mean, at least not in my presence. And I'll tell you why. It was still early enough in the GWAT when I went down there that people were still angry. You remember what that was like. I mean, you were probably pretty young then, but you still remember. You were old enough to remember. And before I went, friends of mine were telling me, "Hey, when you get down there, give them, get some of them for me and get some payback." I'm like, yeah, payback. I'm like, well, that's a cute conversation, but again, you can't do that if you want this guy to go to prison for the rest of his life.
Right.
And the truth of the matter is, torture, it works in the short term. When you start pulling my fingernails out, I'm going to tell you whatever I think you want to hear that gets you to stop pulling my fingernails. Now, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But I'm just going to spew because I don't want my fingernails pulled out. People don't confess to their worst enemy. They confess to their best friend.
Yeah, someone they build rapport with, or has built rapport with them.
Right. And you know this, the same principles that apply on a traffic stop apply in Guantanamo Bay. You've got to establish a baseline. You've got to see where they're coming from. You've got to establish that rapport. You've got to see where the common grounds are. Where is the chink in the armor? Where can I find common ground with this guy that I can work from? What are his hot buttons? What are his motivations? It's the exact same thing that you do in any law enforcement job, because we thrive on making people talk to us and getting them to talk to us and then extracting statements against interest, right? I mean, how many times have you had people tell you, even on something as simple as a traffic stop, you've been drinking? Yeah, I've been drinking. Well, that's a stupid thing to say.
I am more surprised by the number of times people have admitted to crimes and talked themselves into handcuffs than, like, there were honestly times where I call it breaking character, where I told the person, like, you don't have to talk to me right now. And they still, I mean, at that point it's too late. I already had PC, but I'm just like, dude, what are you doing right now? Telling me this stuff.
Yep.
So yeah, it's pretty remarkable and it was just having a friendly conversation, a very weird conversation by general standards because of the roles that we were playing in the moment. But I mean, it's just,
yeah, it didn't involve hitting them in the ankles with the baton.
Yeah, or the number of times I was driving someone to the jail and asking them if the AC was all right in the back and what they like to listen to on the radio. And because I haven't, I wasn't questioned about a crime. I hadn't Mirandized them, and they would just continue to talk about what they had done. And I'm just like, oh, okay, yeah, oh yeah,
First guy I ever arrested for bank robbery. He opened his door, we stormed in, got him at gunpoint, and he just starts crying, pees his pants, and starts saying, I did it. We're like, settle down, buddy. Hands behind your back. I robbed the bank. I'm so sorry. Buddy, you got to shut up. We got to get this done here. We're still sweeping the house, making sure the mail. I did it. I robbed the bank on North Street at 5 o'clock this afternoon. I'm terribly sorry. I mean, I'm like, shut up. Sign the Miranda warning. I did it. I'm so sorry. But again, there's no torture involved. You just talk.
And people are people.
People are people. They're absolutely people. And, I got more information out of these guys by bringing them a cheeseburger from Burger King, or, a Pepsi, a plastic cup, just, it was crazy because you just sit and talk to them and you treat them like human beings. They know now some of them not going to talk. Some of them would sit there and say, look, if you unshackle me, I'm going to murder you. Okay, well, I guess I won't unshackle you then, will I? And they would tell me, look, if you ever let me off this island, I will kill Americans until Allah calls me home. All right, cool.
Yes, we're not going to let you off the island.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
So in my case, at least, we didn't have to threaten them. I mean, the closest to a threat I ever got with any of those guys, and I talk about it in the book, say, look, you don't have to talk to me. You can sit here, and that's fine. And I'll send you back to your cell. And maybe I'll come and see you next week. And you don't have to talk to me then. And that's fine. And then I won't come and see you for a month. And if you don't talk to me then, well, maybe I won't come back for 6 months. And same thing, I won't come back for a year. And then 5 years. Because eventually I'm just going to stop coming back. And then I'm going to go home. And I'm going to see my 5 sons. I was told I had 5 sons. I have a son. And I didn't have any sons at that time. But, hey, 5 sons.
Yeah.
And I said, and I will forget about you. I will retire. I will grow old in the bosom of my family, and I will someday die. And you'll still be here. And some other man is sleeping with your wife, and your children are calling some other man father, and you will still be sitting here. He says, and then you'll grow old, and you'll need dialysis, chemotherapy, open heart surgery. I said, the United States is going to pay for all of that. if we can extend your miserable life just one more day, that's what we're going to do. And you're going to sit here and rot. And long after you are forgotten, and this entire war is over and forgotten, you will still be. Or you can talk to me. Either way, I'm out of here in about an hour, and I'm going to go have lunch. And you're going to go back to your stuff. And it was amazing the number of guys that maybe it didn't work right then. A week later, they're like, "Hey, can I talk to you?" Yeah. So you didn't have to sell it; it sold itself.
Yeah. Do you have any? I mean, without obviously giving away the whole book, but do you have any interesting vignettes from the book that you could share?
Yeah, I mean, right off the bat, the first guy that I talk about in the book was a warlord, and a real deal, honest to God, no shit warlord. And I was the first guy to get a crack at it. It was so funny. I liken it in the book to Eddie Murphy in the movie Coming to America when he's trying to sit on a swing. He's trying to sit in an imperious fashion, but he's got a belly band on, and his hands are shackled, his feet are shackled, and he's on this wobbly 3-legged stool that I put in there. But he's trying very hard to take charge in the room, even in that set of circumstances. With his freshly shaved head and his orange jumpsuit. And, he really was trying to take over. He was trying to take charge of the interview. And I was like, wow, this guy. And then, I had to realize, look, he's in his mid-40s, early 50s at that point. This is a guy who thrived in Afghanistan since the Russians showed up in 79. And for 25 years, this guy has not just lived in one of the most inhospitable war zones on the planet, but thrived, excelled, climbed to the top of his profession, right? So this guy's no joke. I mean, he's probably killed more people than polio, and has been fighting for 25 years, literally 25 years. He's been ruling villages and entire areas, in effect, a governor. So within his bailiwick, he was the man. Problem that he didn't seem to understand was he was no longer in his bailiwick.
Yeah.
So things had changed. Not on the home field anymore, pal. And it was very interesting how I manipulated him and worked with him. And it's in the book, how I gave him little favors and did little things for him in front of the other detainees. And he valued that. I mean, that's important to him. And what I realized, and maybe he did, maybe he didn't, was that if I give him something that he values, I can take that away from him. So if I'm in there, giving him some sort of props in front of his fellow detainees, he gets more face with them, right? He goes up in their estimation. Look, I have these infidels eating from the palm of my hand. I'm going to be here a week. But he doesn't realize that I can walk in there tomorrow and take all that shit away from him publicly. I can publicly humiliate him. Yeah. And
he loses all his bragging rights.
Right. And then all that face that he so desperately values vanished. Or you can maybe tell me where Abu Taylor is so I can drop a bomb on his forehead. And that was a very satisfying piece of that mission as a general statement, was the information that I gleaned there. With modern technology, we would take that raw intelligence, turn it into finished intelligence, and have it in the hands of the warfighters that same day. It was over in Afghanistan.
That quick. Wow.
Hey, sat phones are wonderful things. So you could literally get information from these guys, vet it, run it through the entire processing spiel, and have finished intelligence to provide warfighters within hours. And we did. And it was great. Because then we would get feedbacks like, hey, yeah, we found that guy you told us he was going to be in the third cave on the left, and we went to the third cave on the left, and there he was. Cool. So it was very satisfying in that regard. And I really was happy with the results there. And so, that's what the book's about.
Awesome. Well, guys, go check it out. Dr. Fuller, this has been great. Real quick, where can people find you?
Oh, easiest place to find me is tcfuller.com. That's the easiest place. It's I'm not very imaginative.
I'll have the link in the description.
There you go. I also have my consulting company is at the horusgroup.org, HORUS, or .net, pardon me, not .org. Horusgroup.net. I always mess that up. And of course, you can find the books, and there are currently 3 of them out there, all on Amazon, or you can find links to them on my website.
And what kind of consulting do y'all provide?
I run a consulting company. We do security consulting and high-end bespoke firearms training.
Okay.
So I prioritize privacy for my clients. I sign NDAs. I don't use their photos in any of my advertising. And I tend to gravitate towards high net worth individuals that pay a premium for privacy and for people that have the experience set that I bring to the table.
Awesome. Go check it out.
Absolutely. Check it out.
Well, thank you again, sir. Guys, thank you so much for watching. And as always, train to a higher standard.